The most popular piece of studying advice I've ever given was the Feynman technique. While the technique itself is only loosely based on Richard Feynman's actual practices, the idea has since taken off and has become a studying meme that has since gone far beyond my own audience. The basic idea for the technique is simple. 1. Pick an idea you don't understand very well. 2. On a sheet of blank paper, write an explanation for the idea as if you were teaching it to someone else. And number 3, when you get stuck, go back to your textbook to fill in gaps in your understanding. The technique was a staple of my MIT challenge studying, and I still have dozens of pages of me trying to work through tricky concepts in math, physics, and programming. That being said, I feel like there's a lot of nuance in getting the technique right. Here are 5 tips to make self-explanations work for you. Number 1. Apply the technique selectively. The biggest complaint I've gotten about the technique is that it takes too much time. A course may cover a dozen or more concepts in a single lecture. Writing a couple pages of explanation for each one is incredibly time-consuming. The time spent understanding the intuition behind a concept is not time spent practicing applying it. If you're cutting out practice time for self-explanations, you may end up worse off on the final exam. The first piece of advice I have, therefore, is to apply it selectively. I tend to focus my efforts when I cannot apply the idea in practice questions I've been given, the idea doesn't make sense to me, and I know the idea is central to understanding the class. So my usual approach is first to cover all the material, lectures and textbooks, and then do relevant practice problems. Only when there are impasses there that I believe are owing to conceptual misunderstandings does it make sense to stop and invest the time to do a full self-explanation. Number 2. Go tight for debugging confusion. One reason to apply self-explanations is to repair a misunderstanding or fill in a gap in your knowledge that is resulting in confusion. Unfortunately, figuring out precisely what it is you don't understand is often half the battle. Most of the time, we're simply confused. We don't really have a good sense of what it is that's confusing us. The value of self-explanations then is that by trying to generate the explanation yourself, in your own words, you'll invariably hit an impasse exactly where you're at the weak link in your understanding. This then gives you the tools to go back to your notes or textbooks, to do a close reading, or to give yourself good questions that you can then turn and ask teachers or peers for help with. However, this only works if your explanation was tight enough. If you wrote about the concept in really broad terms, skipping over many of the missing links in reasoning, you can easily convince yourself that actually you do understand something without repairing the missing reasoning at all. Thus, if the impetus for doing a self-explanation was a struggle with a particular problem, start by explaining that exact problem. If it was a confusing section of a lecture, explain the confusing section of the lecture. Stepping back and tackling a very generic concept can skip over details that you really need to understand. Number 3, focus on big ideas for memorability. So the other motivation for doing self-explanations is that an idea is basically understood, but the reasoning feels difficult. It doesn't feel like you automatically get the idea, and you feel like you're probably going to forget it later. One way to think about this is to imagine that the explanation consists of a bunch of different individual facts or steps in reasoning and mental simulations. Confusing explanations are those where the linkages between those parts have not solidified so that the entire idea can be traversed mentally with ease. By trying to generate the explanation yourself, you're reinforcing the linkages between key steps of reasoning and factual propositions that make up the understanding. Once you have the general gist of the understanding, this can be where generating analogies, diagrams, or your own examples can be really helpful. These further associate the ideas involved in the explanation with different overlapping explanations, making them easier to retrieve and walk through in the future. Number 4, don't substitute self-explanations for genuine practice problems. Self-explanations can help in focusing your attention to debug a particular missing link you're understanding, or helping you elaborate and retrieve knowledge used to generate an understanding at a high level. However, it's important not to substitute self-explanations for doing genuine practice problems. And there's a couple reasons for this. Number 1, it's hard to get the right level of depth for an explanation. For hard classes, the tendency is to do self-explanations that don't go deep enough, and thus skip over misunderstandings, even with the deliberate attention that you're trying to avoid this. Thus, doing practice problems helps center you on how deeply you need to understand an idea. Second, learning problem types and common solution moves relies on a separate knowledge from generating an overall explanation. since the knowledge needed to, say, explain Maxwell's equations is only a partial overlap with the knowledge needed to solve the output of a particular circuit diagram, transfer from one of these to the other will only ever be partial. Therefore, if the aim is to pass an exam where you have to do a lot of circuit diagrams, omitting practice questions that resemble those on the test is unwise. Self-explanations primarily help when you hit an impasse with your practice, owing to the confusion or misunderstanding, or practice problems are overly limited and narrow. If the problems don't really cover the full space of potential applications for the idea, then switching to develop a deeper representation of those ideas may be helpful. Number 5, seek out alternative explanations to fill in missing pieces. So a certain amount of close reading and careful reasoning can close gaps in misunderstanding without resorting to new materials. Often the issue was simply that you weren't mindful of an important step in reasoning when you were first encountering it, and so the end result was confusion. However, this isn't always the case. Sometimes a fact is taken for granted by the teacher, and so it's omitted from the explanation, even though it may be necessary for making the correct inference. In other cases, an idea is alluded to, but you haven't mastered it yet, and the explanation doesn't make sense to you. A key step in good self-explanations is to use the knowledge of your gaps to seek out new explanations. Some good strategies include, if the concept skipped over was a prerequisite that you hadn't mastered from a previous course, finding a Khan Academy or online video that explains that particular concept can be very helpful. If the reasoning between two steps wasn't clear, trying to find another explanation of the same reasoning process can be helpful. Different teachers will tend to skip over different facts, so coverage from multiple explanations is often better than from one. Now, while I haven't used it as extensively myself, tools like ChatGPT are also powerful in this regard. Because you can simply copy and paste the text of what you're trying to understand, large language models can often offer useful explanations of omitted steps. Of course, as with all AI-based software, there will sometimes be hallucinations, which mean that they're just making stuff up, but it's generally easier to verify whether a single missing step of a reasoning fits with what you actually are trying to learn. Teach to learn. Although I don't do nearly as many formal classes as I used to as a student, self-explanations are still the bulk of my work. Writing for a living requires me to make sense of newly learned information so I can include it in my essays and videos. As the saying goes, those who know do, those that understand teach.